give you a few minutes to reflect a little bit on what you heard, maybe talk a little bit about that foundational front-end regulatory role that Health Canada plays, your sense of sort of some of the evolving priorities among the sort of leadership of the department, and your sense of how some of those priorities may end up pulling through to some of the other elements that we heard already today.
Sounds good. Can you, oh, we're on. The one thing that's heartening is that I felt like as the presentations went on, it did get a little bit more optimistic as it was going this way, so that's good. I just wanted to say, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm sure all of you looked at it and went, oh, great, this is exactly what I want to hear from a bureaucrat at the last session of the last day. But just to say that it's really important. It's really important for us to be here. This is kind of the bureaucratic version of touching grass. It's important for us to be here to with a very diverse audience and for me, it's coming back to my roots in pediatrics and hematology right here as a fellow. I fellowed at Sick Kids. I didn't know it was a verb. But I was being a little facetious, but I did want to be optimistic because there's a few things. One is that it is a complex system. I'm not going to say that it's not a complex system, but the rule is systems are pretty much, they get results for which, that they're designed to get. So there's been reasons. We have this wonderful confederation that we all work in. There's lots of people that have different responsibilities, and we have a system that's designed that way. I will say, though, after 20 plus years at Health Canada, there's a few things that I do feel are fundamentally different when we're looking at addressing some of these issues. One is, I think we used to look at things in little chunks. So what I've seen, especially over the last few years, is that we're looking at access and through a more holistic lens. So it's accessibility, affordability, universal coverage, and appropriate use. We never did that before. It was sort of this little chunk or that little chunk or this little piece. And especially when we're talking about pharmacare, we're really looking at that overall sort of spectrum. The other part of it is that I promise you we're talking to each other more than we were before. I think we were much more, I think we were in our silos before. Certainly from the regulatory perspective, it's like, okay, we're safety, efficacy, and quality. We're benefits. We didn't even say benefit risk at that point in time because the regulation said safety and efficacy and quality. And then we're going to do our piece and then we're going to throw it over the fence and everybody else will have to deal with it. That's not the case. Now, really, we're looking at the continuum of care, the continuum of access, and what that really means. There really isn't any player in the system that wants this process to take years and years. From a Health Canada perspective, I'll tell you the frustrating part where we see it in situations where we've got a new submission coming in, the company comes in, applies for a priority review process, which is a shorter process, so 250 days rather than the 300 days, 178 days rather than 300 days. They get that priority review, it goes through the review, it gets authorized, and then it sits. And it sits, and it goes through the CADA, the CDR process, now CDA, and it's like, you know what, reimburse it, but it needs a 90% reduction in price. Then it goes off to negotiations, and sometimes those go on for years, and sometimes they don't come to a result. And so we don't want that. We don't want those resources at Health Canada being expended to do something on a priority basis that ultimately is not going to be something that reaches patients. But there's a reason why we get some of these results, right? So a lot of the products, and I'm not speaking specifically for cancer, but we're not seeing blockbusters anymore. We're barely seeing niche busters anymore. We're seeing products that are, questionable in terms of their benefit risk profiles. There's a lot of tortured data out there as well. Things that maybe look promising at the beginning when the confirmatory studies come up don't look so promising. And so there's this sort of level of like, okay, well, how close is it? And what is it? What's that assessment on the risk benefit side of things? What does that mean for the cost effectiveness side of things? And ultimately, in access, although we want people to have access to products, we want people to have access to products that are safe and efficacious and of high quality. By the way, no drug is safe. I know we have to sort of mention that. I feel like I want a t-shirt that says all drugs have risks. It's the risk tolerance that you have for the benefits. If it doesn't have any risks, it probably isn't doing anything. But having said all of that, So there really are buckets. We'll stick with the bucket theme. There are buckets of work that are happening at the Health Canada level, and I can't promise to sort of speak about all of the initiatives and all of the other organizations, but I can certainly speak to it from a federal perspective. So if we're thinking about the way that it's been framed on the policy side and the regulatory side, on the policy side, there are a lot of exciting initiatives happening. I think pharmacare is very exciting in terms of the approach to it. I understand that it's not for pediatric cancer drugs to start with. Obviously, we're starting with contraceptives and diabetes products, but it's the way that we've been going about pharmacare that I think is fundamentally different than we did before. So what's not new? Money on the table. So $1.5 billion, 1.4 of those to go directly to provinces. And then we're negotiating with the provinces on those pieces. But the other part of it is, working with CDA to get a national formulary, to work on bulk purchasing. That's stuff that we've had discussions around this type of thing, whether it's expensive drugs for rare diseases or a national formulary for a long time, but actually setting time to say, okay, CDA, you've got till October 10th, 2025 to give us advice. We put in an expert panel that's just started now in November to give us advice as well. Again, small group, not a cast of thousands to try to move that along. So I think it's really, and again, just looking at things sort of holistically and actually just getting a start on pharmacare. The other piece, again, on that's sort of derivative part of pharmacare is really looking at rare diseases. And again, we've talked about pediatrics being part of that rare disease profile, but even the way that that's been done is very different. So we now have 5 provinces that have signed on, and money has already started to flow. There's a bucket of money from April 1st to March 2027. But also part of that discussion is, okay, so there's money for that, you can pay for that, but we need information, we need data. So there's been work being done on a common list. Doesn't mean that you can't fund rare drugs outside of that common list, but for that common list, let's get some data. Let's get real world data. Let's get some information. Let's learn from this experience. Let's share this across provinces and territories and move forward in that way. So that's not all of the things in pharmacare, all of the things in drugs for rare diseases, but I just wanted to highlight a few things, how we're doing that differently. And then it comes to the regulatory piece. And there's really, again, a few buckets of work that's happening that I find that's really exciting. One is on the clinical trial side. We're looking at modernization of clinical trials, really trying to get rid of some of the irritants that block, whether it's who can do clinical trials, who can be the sponsors, some of the requirements around them, some of the tools that we have that are a bit more nuanced, putting some terms and conditions on those clinical trials, being able to have something that's a bit more nuanced in terms of the Health Canada role. One chunk. Then there's this work on innovative products. So things that don't actually fit into the regulatory review sort of processes that we have. And again, we're using something called a sandbox. So it's like, okay, let's customize a set of sort of rules and regulations for these products that don't necessarily fit into this group. And we're looking at those sort of exceptional products as an innovative group. Then the other part of it is on what we call agile licensing. So agile, I know it's like we used to call nimble, agile, all these buzzwords that we have in the government of Canada, but it really is, we have a system, and it's one of those things where a regulatory system is designed to be predictable, dependable, and it's on a time course for companies where maybe it's a 20-year time course. And believe me, if you make any changes, and like you change a column on a form in the regulatory side of things, and people are in tears. Like there's such a complex system that's set up based on this sort of predictability in a high-risk life sciences environment in a multi-billion-dollar industry. So changing something in that is complicated. It's no excuse. We have to actually be able to do that. And the agile licensing piece is looking at things like, again, putting terms and conditions on licensing, which is something we did through COVID, talking about things like rolling reviews, so information can come in as we work through that, looking at more work around pediatrics, more work around disaggregated data and the SGBA plus analysis. So there's a whole series of pieces there. Apart from that, but related to that, is the pediatric drug action plan that we have. And what we wanted to do is really look at pediatric products and say, what is it that we can actually do that will make a difference in terms of access in Canada? Because some things are intuitive and you think they should work, and you set up an entire regulatory pathway for something to go through, and you build it and nobody shows up because of the realities of us being maybe a small market, or there's lots of different dynamics. So what we really wanted to do is like, okay, what's something that's actually going to make a difference in terms of the Canadian landscape with respect to pediatrics? One of the things that we're looking at is a priority list for pediatric products. We know, and again, not just in cancer, but we've got 75% of pediatric products that are used off-label. And there's a whole host of products that people say we need to have them in Canada, but it's a varied group. Like some of them is just our formulations that are available elsewhere that you think, why don't we have that here in Canada? Some, it depends on the way that the clinical trials are structured. Some are just business decisions. So what we did is that we put a whole call out to the pediatric community and said, bring them out. All of your wish list of products that you want pediatric indications for, and hospital use and community use, primarily focused on the hospital side of things. There were 900 products that came in as part of that list. And so we took that list, we've got a modified list, sort of the highest priorities of about 42 of them. We're doing consultations on that. And the idea is identify a series of products to industry that are shown to be something that are like that there's a need, because companies will come in and go, well, we don't know what the market is, we don't have this, or we don't have that much data, but on these situations it's like, okay, we have these products, we know that these are unmet medical needs, these are the highest priorities, we can work with the health technology assessments ahead of time, so you have some predictability in terms of what the requirements are and what the pricing might, the window might be. Let's see if we can do that as more of a carrot rather than a stick. So we're moving ahead on that work as well. And then with respect to reliance, we're looking at, through a lot of work that we've done on collaboration, whether we know or not we need to do full reviews on some of these products. If we have other trusted regulatory authorities internationally that have looked at this product, where especially if it's a formulation for a product that we're familiar with, do we need to do all of this, or can we rely on those reviews, maybe with a little bit like a paper review or a little bit of a discussion in terms of the authorization, and then we can focus other resources on other products. So all of that work is being done as well. If the system works, and if all the ducks are lined up, it can actually go remarkably quickly for drug development. So again, not a pediatric example, an adult example of the fastest that we've kind of done this process. We had a product that was for colon cancer. It was basically standard of care, had not come to Canada because of some intellectual property issues. We sorted out the IP issues, made a change to the IP sort of structure in Canada, which we were planning on doing. The company had committed to coming in the day after we made that change with a submission. It was an old drug. We agreed to do a paper submission, so they didn't have to do all of the original data submitted. The Canadian Drug Review came in ahead of time. We shared data with them. They made a recommendation. They brought in Ontario and a few other provinces in the review as well. The day after we signed the Notice of Compliance for the approval for Health Canada, it was on the formulary and it was funded in Ontario. I'm not saying all of them will go through that, but but there is a way to do it and to sort of shorten up that structure. And so the question is, if it works for those products, why doesn't it work for other ones? Are there ones that we really want it to kind of function at a high level for? And so the broader piece of this is also, as we said, sort of working internationally with our international regulatory partners. We have a group of mid-sized, like-minded regulators. So Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, and now the UK MHRA post-Brexit. Interestingly enough, our group is also called ACCESS. I think we had it first. We went from AC, because it was Australia, Canada, Singapore, so ACCESS, and then the UK joined. So we couldn't put it, well, anyway, couldn't be ACCESS. So we just changed it to ACCESS. But we do a lot of work there where we share reviews, we do joint reviews, and it's really to the idea of actually a review comes in and you divide it up. One regulatory authority gets this piece, one regulatory authority gets that piece. You all come back together. Everybody's making their sovereign decisions, but you're sharing that. It's like work sharing. And because of that work, many of you may have heard about a project called Project Orbis out of the US FDA for oncology products. And I'll go into what that is. But the reason that the first review under Project Orbis was Australia and Canada is because they knew that we were doing this work, doing work sharing, and capitalize on the work that was already being done for the first product to go through the Orbis pathway. So for people who are not familiar, Project Orbis is a US FDA-led initiative. And the benefit to Canada is that so for Canada, the time it takes from the time a product is developed to the time that it actually gets authorized in Canada is not only a function of that development process, but it depends on what that data, like of course, what that data package looks like, but also when they file to Canada. And so the principle in Project Orbis was for the United States that they were going to, they often are the ones, either US or EMA in Europe are the ones that you get filings to first. But they were saying that they want to have, and again, quite altruistic, but they wanted to have a more robust set of data. They wanted international collaboration and other expertise to come to bear on these submissions, but they also wanted to facilitate earlier filing in other jurisdictions and a more coherent approach to the review. So originally it was just the United States, Canada, and Australia, and we did a joint review. Products got approved in all three jurisdictions, slightly different indications, but it was a really useful process to go through. Now, currently, Orbis has 7 different countries plus the United States as part of it. So it is Canada, Australia, Singapore, Switzerland, the UK, Israel, and Brazil. They're not open to any more. But it's that collaborative sort of sharing of information and hopefully raising the bar in terms of the way that the clinical trials are done and the way that evidence is gathered, but also the way that the reviews are done. So everybody does the review together. It doesn't have to be everybody, but a group of regulators will do the review together. One set of questions goes out to the company. They have one set of responses to give, and we all look at it, and then we all abide by certain timelines, and then we all make our decisions. For Canada to date, that has meant that if you look at the review process, it shaves about 100 days off our review process for oncology products. And it has gone, if you look at new drug submissions, so it's the new drugs, brand new drugs to Canada, but also new indications. But if you just look at the new drugs to Canada, our lag time on average compared to the US FDA for products used to be about 261 days. It's 88 days for products that are under Orbis. So there's a lot of interesting ways that that's kind of been constructed. I'm hoping it continues. One of the things that does not happen for the United States, for the US FDA, is that does not change their timelines because they go by their traditional timelines. It's more work for them because they're working with other regulators as well. But I will say that they have been very appreciative of having more expertise on their files. There's been times where Canadian reviewers, for example, have really picked up an issue that maybe the US FDA hadn't seen before, or they had access to data and data sets that were more diverse and more robust. And so that was really informative for them, also potentially confirmatory for them. So there's lots of work that's happening in those spheres as well. With respect to pediatric cancers, I mean, since 2002, we've had 10, I think 10 new indications come through that process. And so again, if you look years before that, the numbers were much smaller than that. You know, there's I think a lot of optimism that's there. We've had products coming in for vorasidenib, for astrocytoma and oligodendroma, big success story for us. So there's work that's happening. Now, I've rattled a whole series of things off at you, a lot of initiatives, but the idea is, you know, build something once, use it multiple times. If there's an issue around small populations, then maybe it's something that we can address through the rare diseases group. And so, you know, what's the problem that we're trying to fix there? We're trying to fix the postal code lottery that we have right now, that drives what potentially you have access to and what you have covered. You know, the pharmacare is looking at taking some of that load and offloading it on out-of-pocket expenses, you know, doing some standardization, getting some buying power through bulk purchasing, being more standardized in terms of national formulary. The regulatory pieces, like getting rid of some of those irritants, having a more nimble system. It doesn't mean that everything gets approved. And you know, we just had a product that was very promising initially. There was commitments, terms and conditions put on. The confirmatory studies did not show that it was a product that was useful. The company had the results, they provided the results, we looked at it, the product came off the market. We did not have a big hoo-ha about it, but it was just that, you know, sometimes that's going to happen as well, but at least you have a system where you have some of that flexibility and that some of that nuance. So again, we're looking at things much more holistically. There's a lot more crosswalk and crosstalk than we ever had before. There is this, you know, very strong desire to make sure that when money goes out the door, it also is tied to information and data and things that can actually move the ball down the field. And it's really important for, you know, all of the stakeholders to continue this advocacy, to continue, you know, the stories, the narratives, the work that's being done, to be able to distill that, to be able to make the case of where we should move next. I did a master's of public health, and in Boston, they had it was Clinton's former HIV czar that came in, and she was this very outgoing, very blonde, very Southern woman. And she was talking about sort of the heyday of the HIV therapies and having people like come and pour red paint down the stairs of the office. At one point in time, she had somebody who handcuffed themselves to her desk. And she said, look, we need all of that. We need that advocacy. And she said in her drawl, like, it's like the Spanish Armada. You have to float the itty bitty boats out to know where to draw fire. And it's true. So you have to, you know, as much as, you know, there's lots of things that we need to move internally. You know, the joke is there's two things you don't want to see being made, policy and sausage. It's a messy process. It's a process that, especially in the Confederation, takes a lot of time, but the will is there, and I think we're really focused in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and it's really, really helpful from all of the perspective and organizations like ACCESS to really distill down the asks from the community, what really would make a difference, and be able to say that in a coherent way, because then you can take that lovely little proposal and you're like, you know what, we're going to pop this into the budget, or we're going to pop this into this position, or we're going to actually use this to support a policy change that we're going to make. And so I do have full confidence that it will get better. I think we're in challenging times across the board, but I remain uniquely optimistic in terms of what I'm seeing about how we're working together and what we're all striving for.
Thank you, Supriya. So I think the bottom line of those last comments is that every person in this room, every person online has a voice and a role in advocating for, reinforcing, stimulating delivering everything that's required in order to change the system that we heard so much from Avi and Keith and Paul about, and to continue it changing in a direction that the optimism, I think, is starting to be pulled out of these different conversations. So it's fantastic you were all here. We're now going to give you a voice in this conversation for about a half an hour or so before we turn it over to some final remarks from Dr. Polybear. The very quick point that I'll make before we start looking for some hands, which will be wonderful, is this question of Supriya mentioned sort of this, things get popped into a budget sometimes, right? The political element of all of this is not something that should be sort of forgotten or underemphasized either. We are days away, weeks away from an Ontario election. We are months away from a federal election. Canada's premiers, represented by a group called the Council of the Federation, talked about Project Orbis and the need to accelerate access to drugs, in particular drugs for cancer, in December. This is a fertile time for decision makers on the political side, thinking about ways in which they can drive innovation and foster sort of more of the responsive systems, the dynamic systems, the interconnected systems that you heard from all of our panelists already today. So this is really exciting. You all have a role in this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions for the folks who are gathered here at the front of the room. So hands, please. Oh, so many, amazing. We're gonna go orange, then we're gonna go black, and then we're gonna go Daniel.
Good, I get known as orange. So thank you for, I've been called worse, you're exactly right. So thank you for all your presentations. They were very informative. So my comment question is gonna relate, it's gonna have Mar-a-Lago in it. Sorry, Elaine. So just talking about the political context, and so mine's going to go to pricing of drugs, which Supriya sort of mentioned, and maybe needs a 90% reduction for us to be able to have it in Canada. In early 2024, Florida had FDA approval to buy drugs from Canada. I don't think they've acted on it yet, but if in fact Trump was behind that early thing with Biden there, is if more states do this, what is our jeopardy at pricing of drugs for Canadians? Number one, because we'll lose our ability to be able to buy them at that price. And number two, if it goes through, drug supply chain management problems, which happened with Ozempic when this was happening. So are we in a dubious time, especially in these times when elections are in play?
Okay, we're just going to put 25% tariffs on all the drugs.
Yeah.
But you know, so you're right, 25%, but our prices are way more cheaper than 25%, right? I mean, 45%, I think, is about the average. And sometimes, you know, Glybera would be a good example where very, difference in pricing going forth.
Supriya, you're gonna take a first crack at this. Is amazing.
I was going to say, speaking of orange, well, and I mean, and the other factor is the dollar as well. So the dollar going back down under 70 cents is another factor that drives change prices. So I'll do the easier part first. So Florida was not the only state that actually passed legislation in terms of buying drugs from Canada, and then so those are the sort of the formal ones. I think Colorado, there was a number of them. But then we also had, we had Bernie bringing up the train of seniors to get diabetes meds, and there were a number of things that had happened. What we did at that point in time that really helped, and I can't claim to predict what's going to happen, because I do feel like we're in a different environment than we were at that point in time. But what we were able to do at that point in time to protect the supply chain through Canada was to actually put together a regulatory package that prevented the sale of products that could potentially lead to a shortage in Canada or precipitate it. So that was just a basic, and it's challenging to kind of define that and actually say that, but it was at least to be able to backstop the companies a little bit, because the companies didn't want that to happen either. They don't want price stratification. They want to be able to, they wanted to keep price stratification. They want to be able to keep, their differential pricing in different jurisdictions. So at least that was the way to sort of safeguard that type of initiative. That leads to another type of transit. There was sort of companies that were saying that they would actually transit product through Canada and or finding other ways around it. We had at one point in time, and I don't know if we'll see it again, online pharmacy industry was really big, especially out of Manitoba. I don't know if we'll see the resurgence of that, but again, there's been protective measurements so that you can have, like, you still need to have a physician in that process. And so there's ways to sort of safeguard that process. The tariffs are a completely other sort of issue. And what we're doing is that we're doing a full assessment, not only of of drugs, biologics, vaccines, diagnostics, about what the potential implications would be for those. And there are some reassuring things. So, for example, for a lot of the innovative drugs initially on the pharmaceutical side, not on the biologics, a lot of those actually don't go through the United States for whatever reason. There's been some changes in terms of the global supply chains. There are a few that do and are only available through that mechanism as well. So I think we're doing it. It's a broader issue in terms of potential tariffs and what that can do to supply chains, and we're looking at that very closely. But at least I hopefully can give you some reassurance in terms of the pricing. Now, there's still work on pricing that we need to do here in Canada. There's the public system, there's our generics price the way that they should be priced. There is a very opaque process around private insurers and what those prices are set at and what those I did finally take an economics class when I did my master's. I still do not understand that process. So there's a lot of opacity there that we need to sort out as well. And we're thinking about ceilings on products and how we work through the PMPRB and other organizations to do that. So lots of work on the pricing side. I think the way that we price drugs is magic. I really don't understand how that happens. It feels like everything goes into a pot and somebody pulls out a price. And then when push comes to shove, sometimes we can get an 80-90% reduction and sometimes we can't. So I think sunshine is the best disinfectant. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do on pricing here in Canada as well.
Thank you, Supriya. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Dawn Pickering, and I'll preface what I'm going to say by saying I am actually a federal public servant by day, and I'm on my vacation time right now. I do not work in the health realm, but I'm also a person with lived experience. I'm a cancer mama, and my son is here because of the Special Access Program, and I'm grateful for that every single day. He was lucky enough to get a drug under compassionate grounds when I had agonizing conversations about how they were going to be unlikely to save him if we didn't come up with some new option, and a new option was something off-label. So I appreciate your comments earlier about off-label and many of the comments that were made by the presenters today, because I think this is such a critical issue. One of the things that kind of alarmed me when we first heard about Special Access Program and we got this drug under compassionate grounds was we were trying to get some information from the manufacturer, right, about how many kids had taken this drug, what these sort of side effects they were finding in kids might be, and so on. And frankly, our clinician was not able to get any information out of the pharmaceutical company. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, and this is for, it was lorlatinib was the drug. And so, it was for anaplastic large cell lymphoma with the CNS relapse. And, so by our estimation, statistically, there's about 5 kids in Canada who get this a year. So, how do we get that information? Do we get that information, I guess, is my question with respect to the Special Access Program. And how do we, we're talking about numbers and data, all super important stuff. How do we prioritize these particular situations when the numbers are so very small, right? Especially if we can't get data or we don't collect data on these situations. And I'm open to anybody answering, but I'm certainly looking towards Dr. Sharma. So apologies for putting you on the hot seat.
First of all, I'm happy that you managed to you got your product through the Special Access Program. So for people who aren't familiar, there's a Special Access Program for drugs. There's one for devices. It's a little bit different, but it's an exceptional release program. And we have litigation to show that we actually have to take every request on a case-by-case basis. And you'd be shocked to know how little underpins that program. It is 2 lines in the regulations, and released through the Special Access Program basically exempts the company from almost all requirements of the Food and Drugs Act and regulations. It's exceptional release for emergency or life-threatening products for which other products have either are not available or have been tried and failed. So it's because of that, and it's because it's the path of least resistance that they're like, it's so useful, but it doesn't have a lot of checks and balances. So there is a requirement on outcomes, but again, it's on a case-by-case basis that have to come back. There are no requirements on the companies to collect that data, to bring it together, to publish it, to do all of that. We have had success with companies in doing that. So for example, if people remember, I'll use an old example. During SARS, it was ribavirin and peg interferon that was this supposed to be this miracle cure. It's supposed to be really useful in terms of SARS. We really didn't have treatments at that time, and we were releasing it through the special access program. And we actually convinced two companies to be able to collect data. When we analyzed that data, especially for elderly patients, it did more harm than it did good. And so we were able to use that. There was a number of other pieces of data. So right now, to be able to get a company to do that is really based on goodwill. When we are putting in other exceptional programs, so we have a program called the Urgent Public Health Need mechanism. There's also, for COVID, we used what we call interim orders, which are ministerial orders to be able to do different regulatory things. All of them have hardwired in it some requirement to collect that data. So I can't do much on the special access side of things, but I will say that for other initiatives, we're very attuned to that. And again, hardwiring that kind of getting the data in and being able to learn from that experience in a systematic way.
Okay, Paul.
And I think part of that, again, is back to this balance that we do when, as a clinician looking at bringing in an SAP product, you're in some ways looking for the willing and the manufacturers to do so. And I think it's a really tight balance to walk, that we want to be able to provide the patient and the family that information. But in this world of trying to carrot and stick that Avi referenced, we don't want to disincentivize the access to come there too. So I certainly feel for regulators on that front of wanting to have a tight and as safe a possible program, but we also don't want internationally the look to be to Canada to say, well, if you try and allow something there, they're going to ask for all of this else too. So it's a really difficult balance that I think we struggle with as clinicians, but can certainly appreciate where the regulators come from too.
Can I add one more idea that we've done? So just from the special access program, we've had products that have gone into the national emergency stockpile. Like Public Health Agency has put that in the stockpile for our emergency purposes that have been released under the special access program. And so then what we got them to do is, as part of the contract, the company for that purchase for the stockpile, the company has to commit to come in with a submission for review within a certain period of time. And so some of the work that we're trying to do with the provinces as well is that, like, have some of those discussions. Okay, we'll pay for some of those. So it'll go through the special access program. Maybe it'll be part of an expanded access, compassionate release funding sort of program. And then like wire in some sort of commitment to kind of come in and regularize that product.
Okay, folks, so we are running out of time because this is incredibly interesting and all these questions are thoughtful and thought-provoking and everybody wants to get in on them. So we're going to see if we can make the questions a little more concise so I can hammer through as many as possible. And I'll encourage gently my fellow panelists to also be a little more concise in their answers too, because then we'll get to hear from more of you. There was a hand that shot up at the back. If it's particularly relevant or connected to the question we're talking about, I'm happy to let you jump in. Otherwise, I'll circle back around if that's okay. Yeah.
Comment to Don. It's just an opportunity. Can I?
Yeah, can you hear me? I think this is an opportunity both in the era of personalized medicine and pediatrics and small data sets, and also the power of data, because we're talking with Dawn's situation, maybe there aren't a lot of kids, but we can gather the real world evidence. And then when it comes down to that, how do we take that data across the world and share it like is there a Project Orbis that we can do for this type of data that gathers the information across the country in one, across the world in one place?
Thanks, Christina. Daniel.
But just to answer that question, there is a model, which is the SACHA program and SACHA International out of France, where they collect data in terms of safety events and clinical outcomes of patients who've had novel therapies. And we've been discussing whether we could do something like that in Canada. The challenge is that that would require a research protocol, patient consent, data collection, and a whole infrastructure, which is quite difficult to put in place. Knowing that there's not very much time, I'm going to carry on and speak very quickly. So first of all, to say congratulations to Paul, because I think there are some great examples of where we have managed to move on the health technology assessment. And I just want to give the example of dinutuximab, where actually there was a positive approval from the HTA, even though there was no Health Canada indication in the relapse setting, which is pretty remarkable. So that's the good news. I think the things I just wanted to highlight are, all of this ultimately that we've been talking about relies on the manufacturer to actually want to move this forward. And one of the real problems is they don't want to. So the classic example that I would give, again relating to dinutuximab, is GM-CSF. Dinutuximab is approved by Health Canada to be given in combination with GM-CSF. GM-CSF is not approved in Canada, never will be, because the manufacturer are not interested in marketing their drug in Canada. And so despite the fact that the special access program is only to be used in unique circumstances, every time we prescribe that drug, we have to apply for the unique and special circumstances of wanting to import some GM-CSF from the US to treat our patient. And that system, as I understand it, is never going to change as long as we rely on the manufacturer to want to get a regulatory approval in Canada. So that's one contemporary example, let alone all of the drugs that we use every day, cyclophosphamide, topotecan, vincristine, vinblastine, everything, which will never, ever have a manufacturer who wants to go to Health Canada for approval. And the reason all of that is important is, although we as clinicians are very used to prescribing off-label and are very used routinely to using drugs that do not have Health Canada approval or use them outside the label, one thing that's not been discussed is when it comes to clinical trials, the question of whether a drug is being used exactly per the approved label from Health Canada becomes critical, because that is the basis on which Health Canada determines whether or not the study needs to be regulated or not. And so there are many, many examples of where the academic community would like to do what are fairly basic clinical trials, for instance, on antibiotic A versus antibiotic B. But if the label for antibiotic A includes a dose which is different from the standard dose that we actually use, or if it's not approved in pediatrics, or if it's not approved for that precise indication, that suddenly becomes a regulated clinical trial, which means you need Health Canada approval, you need all of the paperwork that goes along with that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, yes, this whole issue about approvals is a problem in terms of access to drugs to be used for the patients, but it actually also has massive, massive implications for the whole clinical trial environment in Canada because of the way the legislation is drawn up. And that is a major, major hindrance to us being able to do clinical research in Canada at the moment.
Keith, you want to take a run at that?
Well, there was a question at the beginning. And I think, and I love Dr. Sharma's point of view, but I think in terms of products that won't or could never come, I think there are opportunities with the new authorities associated with regulatory reliance, which are much more robust than the previous rules about and opportunities for using foreign decisions, which have been in place since 2012 or 2010. There are much more opportunities for Health Canada to use those tools to look at reviews that and approvals that exist in other jurisdictions to take advantage, so that reduce the bar for a company to bring a product. To date, the Health Canada has been more inclined to use interim orders or the importation rules when necessary. But with these new tools, there's opportunities for, and the work sharing with the ACCESS Consortium or with Project Orbis, there are more opportunities to reduce the bar to bring products to Canada without the major lift of a full submission that may help with those things. None of the products that my son received, 57, 62, and 78 were the approval dates for these products. None of them have ever been approved or have a label indication for pediatric use, or anything even geographically remotely close to where his tumor was. Yeah. But they're standard of care.
But that's the bit I hear no discussion about, which is to get to the point where there is a approval or a label for a drug without any involvement of the pharma company, because the pharma company aren't interested in doing it. And we just don't have any mechanism for that at all.
Well, and without a sponsor, somebody has to be responsible for the product. And so they're mechanistically, there has to be a sponsor for Health Canada to be able to monitor or to do its job.
Okay, I'm going to keep us going. I've been neglecting this side of the room. So do we have hands? Oh, come on, you guys.
So can I ask a follow-up then, if there's no question there? So Health Canada has put a lot of effort into putting together an excellent list of pediatric priority drugs.
A couple of the comments that were there, a couple of the questions there.
Please, Supriya, Daniel will come back, but I think Supriya is going to come on some of the points that you just made.
Super quick. On the clinical trial side, absolutely. We're looking at, so for example, we have clinical trials where one is like, it's not even that. It's not even that you're using it at a different dose or a different product, but because you're using one product that's at a new dose and there's another product that you're actually using for an approved indication, that it comes through clinical. So we are looking at what we need to look for and look at clinical trials and whether or not all of those need to be even reviewed by Health Canada, whether there's at least maybe an attestation model or something. So we definitely hear you on the what do you need to see on the clinical trial side. On the special access or the exceptional release products, we actually have done an inventory of all the high flyers and have slowly tried to pick off some of them. And some of them were, like we had a Tomidate, which is something that's used in emergencies, and we didn't have a way to pre-position it. So we went around the regulations so that people could use it, have it there in an emergency department, and then tell us after that they used it. So we are trying to get some of those products off. There are also generic companies that are coming in for some of these older products. And if it's a small enough population, they're getting fee mitigations on the reviews. We're doing a paper submission. We're modifying what we're looking for in terms of the bridging data. So we're trying to find a way. There are going to be products that are just, the business case is not there. And frankly, when you have a mechanism for access, it's like, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free, right? There is a system there where they're already doing it. And so sometimes it's just, we don't want to monitor the products, or maybe it's, this is not a priority. I will say that there's been weird cases where a company has said that they're not going to bring a product in. We had one where somebody on the rare diseases, one of the International Rare Diseases Organization, was sitting beside somebody from a company on a flight and convinced him, like on that flight, to come in with a submission. So it does feel a little more, it's like book flights beside CEOs. So it just does feel a little bit arbitrary, but we are trying to make a concerted effort of like, okay, which ones can we again bring into the system, normalize? Are there carrots and sticks that we can use to try to do that? But ultimately, there's somebody has to make the drug. Somebody has to be able to rely on the quality and the quality assurance and have all that data. It's not just the clinical piece, but and so compelling them to market in Canada, or compelling them to make it offered for a certain purposes is a challenge for us. And that's a philosophical challenge. The question is, are there some places where we make some of those exceptions and say you have to do that? Some areas where those discussions are happening are around antimicrobial resistance, for example, incentivization around antibiotics, new antibiotics coming through. We have a couple that are coming through now. There's been some work there. So we're trying to chip away at it. Any strokes of brilliance or any ideas would be great. But yeah, we want it to be regularized. We want it to kind of fit through the regular system and have everybody have access to it.
Avi, maybe I'm going to ask you a question if I can, and then Paul, you might want to get into this too. I'm coming back to your grid slide where you laid Canada out against a number of other comparator jurisdictions. And this conversation we are having today is not a Canadian conversation. This is a global conversation. And if there is such a thing as third or fifth or ninth mover policy advantage, then we should presumably be smart enough to look at some of those other jurisdictions that have addressed some of these challenges, either carrots or sticks, both of which you talked about, in ways that we can't just plug and play. We have to Canadianize. But can you reflect a little bit on sort of some of the things that you have seen in other jurisdictions that feel especially promising that we might be able to collectively together do a job of bringing here over the coming months and years?
Yeah, happily. And Supriya, you may want to get in on this as well from the regulatory side. But you spoke of Project Orbis and ACCESS. I think those are examples where Canada is playing in the sandbox with a lot of international partners to try to streamline things. On the HTA side, I think there's really interesting examples in the EMA through the pediatric working groups at seeking to streamline and basically harmonize the outcome metrics that regulators and HTA bodies are looking at to try to adjudge basically the safety, efficacy, and value of pharmaceutical products further upstream, like earlier in the process. So there's early scientific advice processes. These are happening CDA and Health Canada as well. Yep. But that's been, I think, a little bit better capitulated in the European context. So basically that work to say, okay, if we're looking downstream and we want to understand not only what's going to get this product to market in terms of its safety and efficacy for sale, but also what's going to get it through HTA bodies for public reimbursement in terms of the values criteria, baking some of those outcome measures into the pediatric investigational plans at an earlier phase. So manufacturers are incentivized to produce that data so their product will be funded. And so the needs of pediatric patients are anticipated sooner. I think that's a potential win. And that's starting to happen more, I think, in the European context than it is in some other jurisdictions. So that's somewhere we have something to learn.
Excellent. Thanks. Paul, do you want to jump on that?
Maybe the only thing I'll jump in too is the opportunity, or maybe highlight the difference between an academic study and a pharma study. I think a pharma-driven study is much better at being geared to not only what will get us approved, but what will get us funded. And having been a little bit on this process of trying to create the information to support to get through the full Swiss cheese in Keith's example, is thinking how we can nudge our cooperative groups to be looking at some of those patient-reported outcomes, but also thinking about it from a little bit of an economic eye to that in some what we think of rather simple data points to collect along the way that can be so valuable when you're trying to show value for dollar down the road too.
Keith?
Well, I would say, I think US FDA with their Oncology Center of Excellence, the surge of pediatric indications approved in the US corresponds almost exactly with the funding and launch of that organization. And it's linked to the necessity to produce pediatric data and file it when it's available. The extent to which that data then comes to Canada and whether it's filed with Health Canada for them to review is another question, and how to incentivize them to bring it, especially for products that have been on the market for a while and maybe towards the end of their period of exclusivity. The pediatric extension of exclusivity only occurs when the filing of the data is timely, quick. So I think whatever model they've used and encourage it, however we can encourage that data to come and be considered will be important. I think it's also worth noting that some companies clearly have a pattern of behavior where they're much more inclined to produce the data and file it. So I think that those companies should be recognized and acknowledged, and those companies that may be less inclined are also, we have conversations with them as well.
Dynamic queue management or something along those lines. Shame-based. Keith, maybe I'll stick with you for a sec. And can you talk a little bit about sort of ways in which the PWLE voice, is effectively and appropriately and importantly integrated into the process you talked about? and maybe what you're most excited about in terms of future integration, future impact, where we go off of this foundation to a better tomorrow, if you will.
Well, if we look at the timeline for the evaluation and review and access for products, there are exactly and precisely 35 business days where the patient voice is welcomed officially. And that's with CDA. So when the submission is filed and they're ready to consider and it's lined up and queued up for a committee meeting, there is a notice posted to say clinicians and patients in the next 35 business days, please produce and submit your input. And so that, despite evidence to the contrary, I am very optimistic about what CDA is doing about improving patient involvement. They have added with FMEC on a trial basis, and later this spring, they're going to be expanding it to their regular committee meetings to actively involve and include the patient voice and the patient participation in the committee meetings. So patients and family members in the case of pediatric indications will be at the committee and present to the members and answer questions and be supported by CDA staff, which is also important because, as Chiquita very eloquently put it this morning, this is a difficult process when your bona fides is the most difficult experience you've ever had.
It's very well
and
put.
your value is there. So the CDA has very clearly demonstrated, their interest in more engagement and supporting patients in providing that engagement. And so I am really encouraged by the kinds of changes that they've made.
Awesome.
And then at the very end of that process with the listing, that's a much more political engagement. Depending on what kind of advocate you want to be, do you chain yourself to a desk, or do you write polite letters or have engaging meetings is sort of where an encouraging listing and that process.
Thank you. Avi or Paul, do you want to touch on this either patient piece or the stakeholder piece?
Yeah, I just wanted to double down on what Keith, I think you really eloquently mapped out different ways to engage with PWLE voices and patients and families in particular. And that's runs the gamut from, when I was on PCODER at what was then CADETH, we have patient-specific members on the committee who help with decision-making. That's different. It's distinct from having written submissions from patients as part of the package of evidentiary stuff, the materials that go to committee, which is different from patient testimonials live in committee meetings, which is different from generating patient-reported outcome measured data as part of clinical trials, which is different from developing tools to do HTA or regulatory work that invokes and incorporates patient perspectives, right? So all of those are robust ways, I think, that we can incorporate patient and family voices. And that's leaving aside the advocacy piece kind of pre and post, which is hugely powerful. I mean, we've seen very powerful examples in Ontario of listing decisions get totally flipped on their head and reversed because, frankly, of pediatric advocacy testimonials at the level of the payer. So I think all of those have a role to play. And I'd actually really like to see those patient and family voices incorporated way further upstream at some of the regulatory discussions, particularly if those are going to be paired with thinking about HTA outcomes further downstream. So I don't know how easy that is, but I think those are that's the gamut of ways that patients could be engaged.
Keith, did you have a final comment?
Just on that 35-day window. ACORN has been involved in 14 or so submissions, and we have a reasonably good network and mechanisms for contacting families. But even then, it's the turnaround time and identifying patients or families who have experience with the condition and or the drug in question is a challenge. And if we're talking often about relapse and refractory conditions as opposed to frontline therapy, the outcomes are often poor. And if we're doing more than one review, we're asking the same question to the same small group of families, often bereaved, and explaining to them why we need to provide that information and why we're asking again is a real challenge. And we're volunteers. We're also experienced with our own children who have cancer and that treatment experience. So it's, you know, the more often we go to that well, the more trauma and the more revisiting. So as much support as we can for that process.
Yeah. Yeah, Christine.
These mics work. I just had a question, mostly for Keith and Paul and Avi, who've been involved with ACCESS way back 20 months ago, forever. Since its infancy. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on how ACCESS in particular could contribute to this, how we could help, how this network of people could contribute to many of the changes we're starting to see, but maybe accelerating them, maybe additional ones that you would like to see. So just in general, a bit of a charge to the group here.
Hold you back. I'm rarely optimistic or enthusiastic about things.
That's why you're going first.
I am very optimistic.
That's true.
About the opportunities that both the new drugs that we're seeing that are on the cusp of either an indication or review. It's an opportunity we didn't have before with all of these drugs who are now through the research piece. With the network of clinicians and experts that ACCESS has pulled together, the kinds of reviews and activities that CDA is doing to improve their engagement and improve their processes, combining those two things, pulling in the clinician expertise that ACCESS has access to, and the opportunity to bring people with lived experience and patients and families and that perspective. I think there are real opportunities to improve and to make those linkages and to bring the expertise and that experience to the committees that are firmly rooted in very strong expertise in cancer treatment, but don't have the lens of the pediatric care and the C17 centers that are quite different, and the experience in terms of drug access, treatment decisions, and just the paradigm of care are different. And you can see that when you read the decision. So I think there are great opportunities to bring those, to build up their expertise or to offer that lens and link them with the expertise of the clinicians and the patients.
If I could just add one thing.
Yeah,
Christine,
you have to be
quickly.
quick though, because you're keeping the president of CIHR waiting.
Okay, maybe one. The only thing I was quickly going to say is I think Keith's right that I think there's a bit of a watershed moment here, both in the fact that systems more broadly are shifting tectonically, and also that ACCESS is now coming out of its infancy and has organization and power and purpose behind it on an issue like this. The only thing I was going to add is that I think we've got to recognize that we're working within a much broader and more variegated system. And we need to do a lot better and more sustained outreach to partners in the institutions that govern the system and that dictate it, and recognize that this is an issue that overlaps with rare diseases. It overlaps with pediatrics more generally. It overlaps with a whole bunch of other regulatory and HTA reforms that are ongoing, and to tap into those, to be able to synergize with them and leverage kind of some of the changes that are happening while injecting our unique voices, I think the only way that this is going to succeed. So we can't do it in isolation.